Are you there, Madeline? Can you put it in the chat? Can you hear? Can you see? Wapinja. Okay, remember, stay muted, though. Amanda Hall. You ready? Good morning. Thank you for coming. If you have a cell phone, could you please silence it? I would greatly appreciate that. Zoomers, please stay muted. You can ask questions at the end at questions and answers, and I'll be monitoring the chat. Rick Gold is here, who's going to introduce our speakers for today.
Thanks so much, Pam. Welcome everybody to the Heritage Celebration courses. And as we've said in previous weeks, that celebrating heritage is important to what America is all about, and that it goes beyond history to ensure that we appropriate, that we celebrate identities, culture, and so that it allows voices that we that are often marginalized to reach out, to speak out to Americans. It focuses also on some of the disadvantages and historical inequities. Today we're going to be taking a look at Native American heritage and how it's celebrated. And the celebrations for Native American Heritage Month in November take place in Florida and elsewhere through powwows, through conferences, through all types of celebrations of music and art and food and other parts of Native American culture. So our speakers today are Dr. Charlie Cobb and Dr. Amanda Hall, both from the UF Museum of Natural History. Dr. Charlie Cobb is the curator of historical archaeology at the museum, specializing in interactions between Native peoples and Europeans during the colonial era. And Dr. Amanda Hall is collections manager for Florida and Caribbean archaeology at the museum. Her research focuses on Native American and European interaction and the coalescences of Native groups during the colonial era. Thank you very much, and I'll pass the microphone.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Hello, everybody. And I'll be giving the lecture. And at the end of it, my colleague, Dr. Amanda Hall, she will staff the table where we have swag that people are more than welcome to take, artifacts that you're not welcome to take, but but we'll look at. Is that okay now?
Yes.
So to start off, I'm going to tell an anecdote. And that is, way back in the 1980s, when I was a graduate student, which, by the way, many of my students see as being the Paleolithic, more or less, so it's nice to have the comfort zone of my own demographic here. So when I was a graduate student, I majored in anthropology, and there are 4 subdisciplines of anthropology. There's cultural anthropology, people doing ethnography of modern peoples. There's linguistics, people studying modern languages and how that interacts with culture. And biological anthropologists who look at the adaptation, physical adaptations we make, for example, high altitude adaptations and that kind of thing. And then you have archaeologists. And the joke is how do you tell archaeologists from other anthropologists? And the self-deprecating answer was, our subjects don't talk back to us. In other words, they're dealing with people, thousands of years ago. And I want to say today, from historical hindsight of 2023, oh, how wrong and naive we were. Because Native Americans today are incredibly interested in their past. They're incredibly interested in archaeology. And they're kind of concerned about what people who aren't Native American, archaeologists like myself and Amanda, might be saying about their past. So one of the things I want to point out today that the museum does is we actively collaborate and consult with Native American communities today to build those kind of multivocal past, if you will. But one thing I can tell you that I can't speak on behalf of all Native Americans, but one thing I can tell you is that one thing that kind of irritates Native Americans is the idea that they're caught in this timeless past. The Native Americans today should look like Native Americans 500 years ago, or they should have all the same cultural traits and what have you. But of course, like all cultures, they change through time. And they recognize the changes that have occurred in the last 500 or 600 years. And they realize the impacts that colonialism have had on their culture. So what I want to do today, I looked at kind of your syllabus of your course, and it'll be less about commemoration, except at the end, but it'll be one facet of your course you seem to be focusing on, and that is tracking colonial legacies. And so what we're going to talk about today, and I think that might be particularly interesting, is not only because it converges with your course, but we're going to be talking about archaeology that's literally in the backyard of this area that I think you might be interested in some of the work that's been doing. So we're going to be talking about the mission experience in Florida, starting with the advent of Florida as a colony, and then I'm going to try to bring you up to modern times to see kind of the Native American take on this experience today, briefly, looking at the mission experience 500 years later. I forgot. Do you have to start it? Voila. Oh, I do the backwards key? Did you tell me it? Sorry. So do I keep doing the backwards key? We'll see. We'll figure it out. Okay. So this is Florida and the arrangement of Native American linguistic and cultural groups circa 1550, let's say, when the Spaniards showed up in the 1500s. And so by and large, from south of Ocala northward, there are very three large linguistic groups that fall into what would become Greater La Florida, the colony of Florida. One were the Appalachians, who are over in the Tallahassee region, and to the far east, northeast on the Georgia coast were the Wali, who are largely coastal adaptation. And then there were the Timucua, which is a very large group that spoke a lot of subdialects like Potano and Mocama and so on, that occupy what's today Gainesville and the surrounding region. And then one thing I want to point out historically as you look at this map is that if you went to Madrid in 1565 and they asked him, the monarchy, to show you a map of Spanish Florida, it would include all the peninsula. But the reality of the matter is that the Spanish never successfully extended the control much further south than Ocala, more or less. So the Native Americans south of there were very, very successful at kind of fending off Spanish intrusions, and are very proud of that history. Whoops. I'll get it eventually. Okay, so we're very fortunate in historical hindsight that we actually have some drawings of Timucua cultures from the time period from Europeans who were doing a lot of illustrations at the time in the late 1500s that they're arriving on the shores of Florida. And again, these would be coastal Timucua groups that I'm talking about here. So one of the things that's important to bear in mind, that'd be important for the mission experience for Native Americans, is that they were maize agriculturalists. It wasn't necessarily a core staple, no domestic crops, but they had a very diverse, broad spectrum diet. But certainly maize was a core to it, and the Spaniards would find that very, very successful for sustaining St. Augustine. These drawing again from the time period of a man and a woman. By the way, I have to say as an aside, we think that some of these are embellished. A lot of these artists were looking at pictures from South America, the Caribbean, or whatever, and we think in some cases they're creating a pastiche. But this is kind of more or less accurate, I'll say, rather than being exactly accurate. This is the one drawing that we have of a Timucua village, what a Timucua village may have looked like in Central Florida around Gainesville. And I say might because we know from our, well, so let me say first that no archaeologists have excavated a complete Timucua village. But we have, from the portions of the village that have been excavated, we know that they certainly had circular structures. They were agriculturalists who were recovering corn, maize, that kind of thing. We've never recovered evidence of a palisade or a fortification around one. Not that it didn't exist, but we haven't. And if you see that square structure in the middle, we've never identified anything like that. But again, that could be a matter of sampling or whatever. But anyway, this is kind of probably what a Timucua village like. Importantly, and something that would be familiar to the Spaniards, and that is the Timucua people typically built their larger villages around a plaza. And the most important structures, that is the ritual structures where the chief lived, they would be abutting the plaza also, which of course is very much a Mediterranean European kind of worldview, or a way of approaching the architecture. So a few words about missionization in the Americas. And I want to say that the Spaniards were very successful, not all at the same time, but sending missionaries everywhere from the tip of South America, Tierra del Fuego, all the way up to Alaska. There are a number of orders involved, and this will be important. The most successful orders were the Dominicans and the Franciscans and the Jesuits. But I'll add there were other orders also that were much smaller in scale, the Augustinians, for example. But these were the three biggies, so to speak, in terms of the missionizing orders throughout the Americas. So you would think that the primary job would be conversion. That was an important task of it, but they were also charged with other duties by the crown. One of them was subservience to the crown, but what I mean by that is the idea is that they would eventually be citizens of the Spanish crown and have to obey the king, the monarchs, and so on, assist in wars and that kind of thing against the English and French later in time, and for organizing labor. And this is a point I'll make time and time again, that the missions were absolutely critical for staffing the labor for the colonies. I mean, you know, there were millions of Native Americans in the Americas at the time that there were only thousands of Europeans. So the mission labor was absolutely critical for mines, for agriculture, for ranches, and so on. So the mission system, at least in early colonial times, was the economic underpinning of most colonial enterprises. Another thing I want to point out is when people think of missions, particularly in the Southwest or West, where this might be true, they think of a number of friars and other religious people and so on who are assisting the friars, and then the Native Americans involved. The reality of the matter is in Florida, Florida was so understaffed in terms of people. I mean, this was not considered a critical colony by the Spaniards. Spain considered Florida to be more a buffer to encroachments from France and England. And also a place where, when you had the occasional shipwreck, it was from hurricanes, from the treasure fleets moving east, it was kind of a port of call to try to salvage those wrecks. So the missions in Florida typically were hundreds of individuals who are Native American and only one or two Spanish friars, literally in the middle of nowhere. So it made for a very interesting dynamic that we'll be talking about more in my lecture. So the friars were greatly outnumbered. Oh, and what I mean by secular clergy for missionaries there is this, so the Spaniards kind of had two divisions of the Catholic Church of clergy. The secular clergy were the priests who ministered to the Europeans, in St. Augustine, for example, and missionaries were individuals who could perform the sacraments and do mass and so on, but they were specifically trained to work among indigenous peoples. And then finally, I want to point out again that the orders varied widely throughout the Americas, which created a lot of diversity in the mission experience. Just to give you a very, very brief example, the Dominicans were very hardcore about orthodoxy, that everything in the Catholic Church order and missal and so on and liturgy had to be followed extremely closely. The Franciscans tended to be a bit more flexible. They're very anxious to learn the local languages. And there's even flexibility in terms of religious beliefs and practices that I would argue, as you'll see at the very end, even continue today, where Christianity could be syncretic in certain ways. In other words, it could incorporate certain aspects of Native American belief systems, so long as it didn't definitely contradict, you know, the core orthodoxy of the Catholic Church. So this is a snapshot of the Florida mission experience, all in one slide in terms of the number of missions. The first thing I want to point out is that this is highly compressed time-wise. So not all of these missions all existed at the same time as one another. The missions you see in blue is the first missionizing experience. These were the Jesuit missions. They were took off in the late 1560s, well, as soon as St. Augustine was founded, 1565, the Jesuits were along for the ride, so to speak. They were incredibly unsuccessful, even though they set up missions as far north as what's today North Carolina and Maryland, and they decided to withdraw. So Menendez, who was the governor of Florida at the time, he asked the Franciscans to step aboard. So the Franciscans started arriving in the late 1500s. In contrast to the Jesuits, the Franciscans were incredibly successful. So again, what you see here is just a snapshot. It's probably not even all of the missions. In addition to the missions you see here, these are the core missions, but the Franciscans set up, because they were short of people to missionize, they set up a missionizing kind of model that's something like a hub and spoke. So you would have a core town where you would set up a mission where the missionary or the friar lived, and then there would be outlying towns that would build a church, and it was a missionary's job to visit that church on a regular basis in those other towns. These are called visitas. So if you include the visitas in here as a reflection of the number of Native Americans who are impacted by the missioning experience, it's literally the entirety of all of central and northern Florida. And the Franciscans radiated extremely rapidly into the interior, starting, like I said, in the late 1500s. And by the early 1600s, as we'll talk about in a second, they were hanging around the Gainesville area. A few words about the internal organization of missions, because this is going to be important for guiding the archaeology that you're going to hear about. But what we know about missions is there was not a strict spatial model of where things had to be, except you wanted to be glommed onto the plaza somewhere, because that was known to be important ritual space. But there were a set number of buildings that always went with these missions and into the interior. And one of them was a convento, and that was the living quarters for the friar or friars. Sometimes there would be 2 friars. You occasionally would also have governors who do visits, or a bishop, and so they would stay in the convento. But by and large, 1 or 2 friars are living in the convento, a structure. How big are these structures? 10, 12 feet long, something like that. The cocina, which is a formal kitchen area. This could be a building that was attached to the convento, or it could be an outbuilding. This is an outbuilding. These were times when you cooked over an open fire, and you want to separate your kitchen so that you don't catch your domestic quarters on fire. Had to have a church. Probably the first building went up. There was an indigenous cemetery in the church. People were buried in the floor of the church, Native Americans. I'll show you kind of a rendering of what that would have looked like. Then you have the Native American village, and I can't overemphasize again enough, a Native American village that may have scores of houses and hundreds of people surrounding the 1 or 2 friars that live there. The plaza, which is this core sacred space to Native Americans of their space, which, by the way, this entire model of a village more or less has been carried to Oklahoma today after removal in the 1830s. And there are Native American villages today that still have plazas and sacred spaces like this that they use for their ceremonies. So this is a very incredibly persistent tradition, including as well the occurrence of council houses. This is one of the, and I'll build that into the point at the bottom, the importance of maintaining traditional political and social systems. Because the Spaniards were so short of personnel in Florida, they more or less, as long as the villages followed a Catholic lifestyle and were happy with the friars there, they more or less let the native indigenous political systems continue on as they were. The same chiefs, the same important families. The chiefs were the ones who ordered day-to-day life, not the friars. The friars are largely responsible for religious life. This is completely different from the French and the English experiences in North America. The Spaniards were the only one who allowed this kind of dual system to exist. And one of the important components of this dual system was the council house. The council house was a large structure that would also be placed on the edge of the plaza. Sometimes religious ceremonies would occur in the council house. Very, very important for making political decisions. Again, this is a pattern that exists until modern times today. You will find council houses in Native American towns in Oklahoma today, as well as some parts of the southeastern U.S. This is an example. If you haven't been to San Luis de Talamale, try to put it on your list. This is in Tallahassee. Forgot the town for a second. This is in Tallahassee. So this mission site was, again, in Tallahassee, and it was such an important part of the mission system. The soils here were so fertile that the Appalachia region by the 1630s and 1640s became one of the bread baskets of the Florida colony. And so at San Luis de Talamale was one of the very, very few missions that had not only a mission representation among the Native Americans, but also had a very large garrison in Presidio, which is kind of a political center. So there are a number of Spaniards living here. The upshot of that point being there is that the state has reconstructed the site based on the archaeology done there. And it's an incredible way of immersing yourself into what it must have been like in the 1630s and the 1640s. And this gives you a sense of some of the architectural expertise of Native Americans. This is a huge structure, several stories high. The posts are about that big, the core posts. I mean, there's a lot of labor that went into making these council houses. It could hold hundreds and hundreds of people. The Spanish did not dare to undermine this tradition. It was just too important politically. So here I'm going to talk about what happens more or less in hindsight as the Spanish mission system became implanted and matured. This became kind of a locus of what many historians call the Columbian Exchange. And Columbian Exchange is shorthand for that complete transformation of the world in the ensuing centuries after the European colonial experience. And the Columbian Exchange refers to stuff that crossed the Atlantic in one direction and stuff that came across the Atlantic in the other direction. And oftentimes we often see this as what are the things that Europeans brought to the New World that transformed everything. But the reality is it was a very much a two-way street. And missions, particularly North America, were really the beginning point in this part of the world for what constituted the Columbian Exchange. So just to give you a few examples, a very sad one is European-born epidemics. Native American populations were devastated by Old World, I should say, diseases. Smallpox was a particularly big killer. You know, the best records we have, I mean, people have fights all the time and debates about numbers and mortality rates and what have. You know, the Spaniards, not surprisingly, were very interested in maintaining censuses, particularly in Central America, because of the large number of people they were trying to corral. Using old Spanish records, it's estimated that in larger Mesoamerica, the core of the Aztec Empire and so on, at the time of Spanish arrival, there may have been 25 million people. 100 years later, where we have more accurate censuses, there were only 3 million people, okay? Much of that was due to the impact of Old World diseases. So this is something that Native Americans were struggling out throughout the colonial experience. New plants and animals were introduced. Wheat and cattle were particularly popular in Florida. I mean, the Spaniards wanted, they wanted what they were used to, not surprisingly. And when you think of the liturgy, for example, the host had to be made out of wheat, according to Catholic canon. So there's a lot of reasons why, you want to have wheat being grown. So the Native Americans on the missions are growing their corn, but it's also being encouraged to grow wheat, particularly to feed St. Augustine. On the other hand, the Spanish colonials did eat maize and various maize products. They were actively trading with Native Americans. The deerskin trade became very important, collecting deerskins in North America and sending them over to Europe, where they were very, very valuable for clothing, hats, and that kind of thing. And importantly, a point I've alluded to on several times, the missions were critical for supporting St. Augustine, kind of the one urban area in an entire colony of La Florida, okay? St. Augustine, the soils around St. Augustine aren't so great. And you also have, again, a relative labor shortage of people to farm the soils anyway. So St. Augustine could not feed itself. So Native American missions were kind of the food line to St. Augustine. And that food line was structured around a system known as repartimiento. And what the repartimiento was, it was a mandate to missions that for several months every year, individuals had to march off to St. Augustine and work in various civil and public projects. They would be paid something, but it was often fairly minimal, and then they would return to the village. So that was often a source of acrimony. If you've been to St. Augustine and you've seen the giant fort there, Fort San Marcos, that was built on the backs of Native American labor, okay? That could not have been built if it weren't for the repartimiento system. So again, the missions were absolutely critical to the survival of Florida. And again, a point I want to emphasize that I've made before, and amongst all of this, the Native American missions were very adept at maintaining themselves as a very autonomous group, at least from the political angle, insofar as at least made minimal noises about owing fealty to the Spanish crown. Okay, so let's speak a little bit more. This is just another follow-up point I wanted to make, and that is by the time the mission system had matured and moved into the Appalachian region by the 1630s, a royal road was built from what's today more or less Tallahassee and ran to St. Augustine, an incredibly important conduit for supplies, people, for individuals moving among the repartimiento and so on. So, and Dr. Hall told me the other day that there are portions of modern roadways that still follow this path today. And so the reason I put a question mark up here is that, like, until the 1950s or so, most of what we knew about the mission system was largely derived from historical documents, which only makes sense. You're dependent upon the missionaries, the bishops, the governors who are making the visits, and so on. So an archaeologist rely heavily on history and historical records, but we also think they're skewed because, of course, they were written by Europeans. And because they were written by Europeans, we really had a very poor sense of what day-to-day life was like for Native Americans, okay? If you look at the Franciscan accounts, they're very interested in terms of the adeptness Native Americans to picking up on the Latin in the service, to following the proper ceremonies and performances in the church service, and making sure they grew enough corn and so on. But what they were doing on a daily basis, we really don't know a whole lot about, surprisingly. So, this is where archaeologists, after World War II, there was somewhat of an explosion of mission archaeology, particularly in Florida. And so archaeology has arisen as kind of a complement to try to dig more into the daily lives of the people, the friars, as well as the Native Americans living here 300 or 400 or 500 years ago. So one thing I point out too is that, this is on Amelia Island, a very important mission complex has been excavated a number of years ago. One of the missions was known as Santa Catalina de Amelia. The other one is Santa Catalina de Yamasee. Okay, and this is the one to the north. But this is a burial ground that's excavated about 30 years ago or so, whatever. All Native Americans buried in the floor of the fort, of the mission. And the first thing that stands out to an archaeologist is the incredibly kind of linear, ordered way that the burials occur, which is very much an outgrowth of Christian burial practices, okay? You wouldn't see this in indigenous ceremony. They tended to be not this rigid, I should say. But bioarchaeologists are individuals who look at human bones, and they look at things such as the sex of the individual, the age of the individual, various demographic factors, but they're also expert in looking at pathologies in bone. And one of the disturbing things that was discovered as a number of these cemeteries were analyzed by bioarchaeologists is a lot of severe health problems that were being suffered by Native American populations living on missions. Now, add to this, they did have a benchmark for comparison. So there's been a lot of studies done on indigenous populations preceding the arrival of Europeans that showed them not having hardly any of the conditions that I'll point out to you here. So some of the common things that were found on this cemetery at Santa Catalina de Amelia is an increase in caries or cavities. That's kind of interesting because what they suspect was, remember I talked about when I say they, I mean the bioarchaeologists. If you remember me talking about maize being very important to the diet, but it was not a complete staple. They had a very broad spectrum or diverse diet. Well, the belief is now, that the missionaries were forcing the mission Indians to be much more sedentary than they were before, to live on the mission all year round, whereas before they had been hunting and gathering, and become increasingly dependent on growing maize for surplus for St. Augustine, and also eating maize themselves. And maize, of course, is a high starch food, which lends itself to caries and other tooth problems. Enamel hypoplasia. Enamel hypoplasia is growth arrest lines in the teeth. You see these like literally horizontal notches that occur across the teeth. This occurs only during times of food privation, where people are going through short periods of starving, where the tooth enamel, the tooth literally quits growing for a period, and then it starts growing again. So periodic food shortfalls appear to be occurring. Criba orbitalia is a pitting on the top of the eye orbits, and it's associated with protein deficiency. Parotid hyperostosis also is pitting on the skull, and that's related both to protein deficiency and a lack of vitamin C. And joint arthritis becomes more common among Native Americans at early European period. And we think part of that may be related to repartimiento, because these individuals are having to carry very, very large and heavy loads to St. Augustine and oftentimes back to their towns. In fact, some of the rebellions you see during the mission period, and there were several, is in revolt against the demands of the repartimiento. These are some of the objects that have been found amongst Native Americans in living areas, habitation areas of, not surprisingly, a lot of Catholic paraphernalia. I find two things particularly interesting in this list right here, and one is the figa. If anybody's spending time in the Mediterranean world, in Italy or Spain or what have you, this is a sign of good luck. And one thing to remember is this is a time when people not only, people were Christians, but they also believed in witches and warlocks and other things like that. So good luck talismans could be very important for getting through the day. And so Native Americans were picking these up as well. The quartz crystal cross comes from San Luis de Talamale, the mission in Tallahassee that I pointed out to you earlier. This is unique. It's not unique to have a cross, but quartz crystal is native to Eastern North America, and it is a spiritually highly, I want to say it again, it is a highly prized spiritual raw material. You don't see Spaniards making or wearing crosses made out of quartz crystal. So this is one of the instances we believe where you see the syncretic or blending of religious beliefs from both the Native American world and from the European Christian world. We have a scholar at Florida now, Aaron Broadwell, who's a linguistic, one of those people whose subjects do talk back to them. So he's a linguistic anthropologist, and he's done some amazing work. He's been tracking down documents where the Franciscans would write the same book. And here you see a manual and another one, a catechism, in 3 different languages. So you have Spanish, Latin, and Timucua, and they have evidence from the introductions to these books that Native Americans were involved in writing these books. So what you see here are Catholic documents, so to speak, manuals that are written in Timucua. So the Spaniards have used Spanish letters, that we rely upon, and are writing Timucua words. And so Aaron is taking documents like this, as well as other documents that are more secular in nature, also written in Timucua, and he's reconstructing the Timucua language, which I think is incredibly fascinating. Incredibly important also because the Timucua people, as we know them, no longer exist today. They're not a federally recognized tribe. They don't exist as a name in Oklahoma and so on. So this is the gang. We started working at a mission site literally on the edge of Gainesville last year, having an archaeological field school. The site had been explored in a minimal way before. We knew it was there, but we wanted to get a long-term project going on to kind of resuscitate mission studies since they've kind of flagged in recent years. Particularly handy because the site of San Francisco de Potano is right on the north edge of town. And so this is, on that map I showed you before, this is San Francisco de Potano, right near the Royal Road. And this is a brief history, in a nutshell, of San Francisco de Potano. It was established in 1606 by a friar, or a fray is Spanish for friar, by Fray Martín Prieto. And this was the first major mission established in interior Florida, okay? St. Augustine had established a couple of missions around kind of an arc around St. Augustine, but this is the first mission in interior Florida. And it's no accident he landed where he did or built a mission where he did, because Potano, the indigenous name for the town, was, so to speak, the capital of this larger region, okay? It was a large town of hundreds of people with a very powerful chief and a lot of subsidiary satellite towns that were subservient to it. So a great place for a missionary to be for setting up a doctrina as well as the surrounding visitas. It was abandoned during the Timucua Rebellion of 1656. And I mentioned that there were several rebellions among Native Americans on missions. And I will say that is a universal. If you go look at mission history from California all the way across to Florida, rebellions were quite frequent, but they weren't always against the friars. So oftentimes they were against the repartimiento system. So interestingly enough, in the Timucua Rebellion of 1656, which threw off missions and burned missions in the entire region, not a single missionary was killed. They were all saved. So the Native Americans were attacking soldiers who were stationed around the region. And then after layover of 3 years, St. Augustine and the Franciscan missionaries felt it was time to start all over again. So the mission was rebuilt 3 years later in 1659. In the early 1700s, as the mission system was falling apart, I'll talk more about that later, the Spaniards set up a garrison of a small number of soldiers, lived alongside the missionaries and the Native Americans. And then it was abandoned for good in 1706 for reasons that I'll talk about in a few minutes. But the long and the short of it was one of the largest and most important missions in the entire Spanish mission system. And it was one of the longest lived for 100 years. Very unusual, particularly in interior Florida, given troubles we're about to hear about. But from an archaeological perspective, the good and the bad of it is it's kind of fascinating, but it has a complex occupational history, which means it's a very complex and thorny problem in the field to deal with. So one of the things that we're talking about is how do we deal with that in the field in terms of unraveling this very complex and fascinating history. So this is the north side of Gainesville. And if you're familiar with San Velasco Hammock, the state park, this is the edge of the hammock of the state park. And this is, handily for us, is IFAS, or University of Florida property. So the site we know from previous investigations kind of overlaps in a big oval both properties. And it's nice also because it's protected in the sense that the state park keeps an eye on it, and you can't even get to the property unless you enter IFAS property, which you have to have permission to do. So that's one of the advantages of it. And of course, being University of Florida property, they were, as well as the state, they were kind of happy to see a project start here again. So I give a list of questions I'm commonly answered in archaeology. It's kind of like, what's the coolest thing you've ever found? What's the oldest thing you've ever found? How do you know where sites are? And how do you know where to dig on a site? And the latter question is like one of the most difficult methodological issues we deal with. So imagine that, I'm going to return to the map here for a second. The site is a giant oval, probably at least 150 meters long, probably similar width, maybe even larger. So, and you know, when we started dig our test units, only 1 meter by 1 meter. You know, if you didn't know where to start, if you're just randomly placing units around, you may not hit anything except 1 or 2 artifacts or something like that, and think you have hardly an important site at all. So one of the things that we did last year to kind of orient ourselves and to give ourselves a better sense of a site that we knew had a complex occupational history is we metal detected the site. We methodically metal detected the site. And when I see these squares are where we metal detected, one of the reasons they're so scattered and odd is we're metal detecting in the tree area of the site. We only excavated in the forested area, that's the area that's state park. So, you know, we have giant trees and tree falls and brush and that kind of thing. And to swing a metal detector, you have to have a relatively clean surface. So we had to be about kind of selective about where we metal detected, but we were incredibly successful. So what you see here are the grids here are the areas within which we metal detected. And these little squares are excavation units that we've placed. And the colors tell the relative density of the number of artifacts, particularly nails that we were recovering. So an orange would be really high density, yellow is a lower density, and green is relatively low density of artifacts. Most of what we found, with some cool exceptions, most of what we found were nails, iron nails, that are wrought iron, so we know they're contemporary with the period, which have allowed us to kind of lay out at least an initial idea of where the Spanish buildings may be. And what you'll see is, and I want to add that we've metal detected more recently, and we have several more clusters or high density areas to the east of here, which kind of fits our model of the complex occupational history, because if this were a short-lived mission, I would expect there to be 3 Spanish structures. You know, you have the Doctrina, you have the kitchen, and you have the church. And those were built with nails, and Native American structures were not built with nails. So we would have expected kind of 3 clusters. Instead, we have multiple clusters, which we think reflects the fact that when the mission is rebuilt, it's probably offset a little, and then you probably have a barracks or something as well as here belonging to the Spaniards. And so this is one of the areas that we focused on. We noticed we had these clusters of nails around here and a big void in the middle, which we thought maybe the void was the floor, and the nails and the circumference around it belonged to the walls where they had collapsed or what have you. And to some degree, this is held out. So these units you see here, these rectangles are excavation units, and the dark circles are posts. And you get the remains of post evident because these are organic entities. In other words, they're made out of wood, and they rot in place, and they leave, for archaeologists, really nice round circles in the soil that's much like this natural subsoil is much lighter in color. So we can literally follow out the outlines of where the buildings were. So we found this that kind of confirmed the hypothesis that there does seem to be a Spanish structure there. Whoops. Oh, other things I want to point out is we found a lot of faunal remains in these units. In other words, small fragments of animal remains, white deer and so on. We found a barrel band fragment. And a barrel band fragment is, if you imagine a barrel being made of wooden staves, these are the metal bands that hold the staves in place. So we have those elements being found with this structure. And we also found probably one of kind of our iconic artifact from the site that we have here. And we found a big brass pestle. So we think this is possibly the kitchen. These are the kinds of things that you would associate with a kitchen building. You know, food remains, something for grinding, plant remains, and so on. Just a hypothesis. But this is how we go about reconstructing a mission site. And I emphasize that we're moving very slowly. We've uncovered very little of the site, relatively speaking, so we have a long ways to go. We've excavated this portion of this. I want to point out also that the area at the very top seems to be the Native American part of the site. We've found elements of Native American structures up there, those oval buildings that I showed you the picture of at the very beginning. So now we are in a process where we just started work a couple of weeks ago, again on our second field season, of testing these areas of high artifact density, particularly metal artifact density. This area, we found a gun site. Is that maybe related to the Spanish barracks? We'll have to evaluate that more in the future. This is an example of, we know we can distinguish Spanish posts from Native American posts in building construction because Native Americans typically would sharpen a post and kind of stuff it into the ground. The Spaniards, thankfully for us, they would dig a hole and they would put a clay base in the bottom of it for stability, and then they would put the post on top of it. So we can, to some degree, we can distinguish Spanish posts from Indian posts, which will be very important in the future for, you know, kind of teasing apart the village and what structures belong to whom. This is an area of the site that also had a high density of metal on it. I think it's another building. It had a book clasp. So perhaps this is a doctrina, perhaps where the friar was and where he had his books. We also have this artifact up here. We found a bell fragment. This is one of the most exciting things we found, and particularly because bell fragments are kind of rare. This would have been a handbell. And you talk about good luck and bad luck. We saw this lettering on it, which is really bizarre. And thankfully for internet today, you know, you can start sending this out to your other kind of nerdy archaeology friends who have this arcane knowledge. And somebody mails back and said, "Oh, that's Flemish for a year. That's common on bells of the period." And he said, we hadn't shown him a picture of it. And he said he should have the year after it, you know, when the bell was cast. And I'm like, ah, it broke. So somewhere out there is the rest of a bell with a year on it. This is a metal medallion we found in the Native American area of the site. Again, a reflection of the performance of the Catholic beliefs of the time. What's mind-blowing is that when we started scoping around if there were any other medallions like this, we found that Jamestown, Virginia, an identical medallion had been found. There were Catholics there, by the way, at Jamestown. They were largely Protestant, but there were some Catholics. We found these, a tinkler cone. We have one of these. Is something Native Americans would have made themselves out of scrap brass, and you would hang from your clothing, and they would tinkle and make a tinkling noise. These other pendants that are used in veneration. And they'll talk briefly about the excavations, and then we'll close out. So this is some of the things we're getting while we're working. We're getting glass beads. Native Americans had a huge demand for glass beads. And most of the glass beads, not all of them, most of the glass beads, if you've ever been to Venice and Murano Island where all the glass is being blown, man, those guys were cranking out millions of glass beads every year, and they were going all around the world after the 1500s. Native American pottery, which is about 90 to 95% of the pottery on the site, because the Native Americans are continuing their lifestyle. Spanish pottery. This is an example of what a giant pit would look like. Native Americans would build large pits for storage and for food preparation. And then thankfully for archaeologists, they would fill those pits in with garbage, and you love to find things like this. They have maize remains, chips from working tools, and so on. A giant post that we believe belongs to a council house, perhaps. And say giant, this is like a meter deep, it's 3 feet deep, about this big around. You don't find those with typical domestic structures. Again, this is found in the northerly part, the indigenous part of the site. Another example of a Spanish post. And so here I'm going to talk about the close of the mission system. So the mission system collapsed due to the convergence of a number of unlucky factors. Pathogens already talked about. By the mid to late 1600s, slaving on Native Americans was occurring. This was encouraged by the English. Charleston was founded in 1670, and they were creating alliances with Native Americans and encouraging them to capture Native Americans as slaves that were then shipped to the Caribbean. Some historians have estimated that 10 to 20,000 Native Americans at least were enslaved and sent to plantations. In fact, it's the demise of the Native American population in this area, that led to the demand for the slaving expeditions that would begin in Africa afterwards. French pirates attacked Florida in the 1680s, led to the collapse of a number of the important missions there. Queen Anne's War, a major war broke out throughout Europe in the 1700s, known as the War of the Spanish Succession, and colonies carried that warfare elsewhere. So when this war broke out between England and Spain and other rival groups, the English colonies invaded Florida and again did everything they could to undermine the mission system, which they knew was the lifeblood of the Florida colony. And so by the 1700s, this entire system had been deserted, the mission system in the interior, and the remaining missions had all clustered around St. Augustine for safety's sake. So all these missions literally wiped from the map, either deserted, abandoned, or burned by the English and their allies. So by the 1700s, there were only 7 missions left from the scores of missions that existed beforehand. In 1715, the English had a major war with a group called the Yamasees. The Yamasees were on the losing end eventually. A number of them moved south after 1715 and briefly reinvigorated the mission system, but it didn't last for long. So the mission system briefly grew from 7 to 10 missions. And this will give you kind of a chronology, a demography of the demise of the missions as well as Native Americans in the state. In the colony, and that is at its peak, perhaps exaggerating, but at its peak, the Franciscans claimed by the mid-1600s they had 20 to 25,000 converted Native Americans in the mission system. Okay, 60 to 70 years later, they're left fewer than 1,000, and these numbers continued to drop as Spanish took their censuses. 350. 155 by 1752. 1759, on the eve of Spain giving up Florida to England as a result of the 7 Years' War, there are fewer than 100 Native Americans left. The Spaniards leave in 1763 as they give up the colony, and the Spanish crown asks the Indians, do you want to stay here, or would you like to go with us? And they chose the latter option, and they were moved to a community in Cuba. But as various people have pointed out, even throughout these bad times, like Amanda Hall's work has shown, she's worked on a mission site in St. Augustine, even throughout all these bad times and their incredibly diminishing numbers, they still are insistent on maintaining their core of their life way, okay? Most of their pottery is their own. They're not interested in European pottery. They continue to use bows and arrows in addition to muskets. So they were still very much recognizably living the lifestyle of the 1500s, the few remaining Indians that were around by, the late 1700s, okay? An incredible adherence to tradition, something they're very proud of. So finally, to close out, I just want to say, what are the missions? This will take like 2 or 3 minutes, and we'll leave time for questions, and then we'll look at stuff. So the mission experience didn't end with the collapse of the mission Indian system. By the early 1800s in what is now the United States, there are very large groups, as I know everybody knows, of Native Americans, Cherokee, Choctaw, and so on, who own substantial lands in the American Southeast, and these are still considered sovereign lands by the federal government, okay? So Native Americans own half of Mississippi at least, okay? So, but they're anxious to assimilate the Native Americans. And so Congress passes a law, 1819, called the Civilization Fund Act. And I'm not a, I'm not a legal scholar, but I don't know if this would pass muster with the separation of church and state today. What the federal government did is they gave block grants to various Protestant denominations and said, if you can get permission, if you can get an invitation from the Native Americans to build a mission on their lands, we will give you thousands of dollars to establish that mission, but we don't care about the proselytizing side of it. This is the government side of it. But we want you teaching the Native American kids English and the industrial arts, the things that we associate with being civilized. Because again, in these surviving territories, Native Americans in many ways are still living very traditional lifestyles. Very small percentage speak English and so on, even though they're now living in the middle of the United States. So we've done work on a mission known as Charity Hall at the invitation of the Chickasaws. So we've been working with the Chickasaw Nation, now in Oklahoma, although this is their traditional territory, for the past 10 years or so. Amanda and I have both worked with the Chickasaws and continue to do so. Whoops. So we've done some work at Charity Hall. And as an example of the collaboration that's going on today with archaeologists, the Chickasaw approached us about 8 or 9 years ago and said, we're willing to fund some of your research on our territories because we know you're interested in working on our traditional lands, but there's a catch. And the catch is you have to train college-age Chickasaw students to do field archaeology every summer. And we're like, awesome. So we've been working with them for a long time now. And this is an example of one of the Protestant missions that we worked on. The one difference you'll see during this time period is even though the kids of the era probably didn't speak English until they spent some time on the mission, in terms of material culture, very, very westernized. There's very little evidence of traditional crafting. They're using plates and stuff that other people would use elsewhere, typically in the United States, who are not Native American. And so the final points I want to make is that the Chickasaws are very proud of this history. Most of them are Christian today, but they continue to intertwine traditional belief systems with Christianity. The green corn ceremony is an incredibly important ceremony among all Southeastern Native Americans. It's carried out in the late summer, and it's part of a rite of fertilization every year, hoping that you have good crops and so on. So that's very important. And one of the things that's another important thing I like to point about the Chickasaws is, has anybody here ever gassed up at a Love's gas station before? They're everywhere. So we have the roles of the kids who are on the various missions. These were Presbyterian missions, by the way. We have the roles of the kids' names. Some of the kids are Loves, is their last name. Love's gas station is a Chickasaw enterprise. And in fact, it's not a tribal enterprise. It was formed by a married couple in 1964. They bought their first gas station, and they had this crazy idea. It's like, my brother-in-law used to have 2 gas stations. He said, you don't make money selling gas. You just make enough to pay for the electricity and so on. So the Loves, knowing that, they came up with this idea. It's like, what if in addition to our grocery store, we built a convenience store in here as well and sold potato chips and Cokes and popcorn, something that rapidly caught on by the 70s, 80s, and 90s, which we now take for granted today, and which led them to form this incredibly important chain, which is kind of an economic linchpin of the Cherokee Nation. So just to close on that kind of happier note, this is an example of the Cherokee Explorers Group at the end of one of our digs. And we'll be out there again with them this year and next year, and hopefully for many years to come, continue and to sustain their heritage, working side by side with them rather than working for us. Thank you. Questions? Her question is, could we say more about the Timucuan? And that is, I will say that the Franciscans and the Jesuits also were very interested in learning indigenous language, and they were very interested in conserving Native American languages. And they thought that it was very helpful to converse about the Bible and through the Bible, as well as other issues, in the native language, at least it's kind of a transition kind of exercise. So that's about all I know, except that there are accounts. We don't have any existing copies of that I'm aware of. I've seen missionary accounts claiming that Temucos are writing letters to one another in their language. So unfortunately, there are far too few of these documents left.
Do you have a favorite book or text that tells us, maybe more than one, but what's your favorite book or text about the Indians that
I-
you talked about today?
I would say, to me, one of the best texts on the mission period, particularly in Florida, is a book called by a former faculty member here by the name of Gerald Malanich. And it's called Laboring. It's called Laboring in the Fields of the Lord, and it is written for everybody, and it's not overly long, which I like in books.
And it's
So-
called what again?
It-
Laboring,
In the Fields of the Lord,
laboring in the fields of the world.
of the Lord, Lord.
Oh,
Lord.
laboring in the fields of the Lord.
Correct. And it's a great and very smooth read. He knows how to write for a popular audience. Sir.
For most of those images you showed near the end at San Francisco, the Mission San Francisco. Okay. I recall Mike Gannon saying that that was the first use of San Francisco as a site in what's today the United States.
I'd say he's right. For everybody else, Dr. Gannon is a highly esteemed historian of Spanish colonialism, and yeah, I think Patano was the beginning point, getting away from the coast of the mission system. I will say, just to add on to that, though, is just kind of a matter of side interest. It's like these Native Americans had not ever seen Spaniards before, because Tampa Bay was a major a major landing point for several major Spanish expeditions, like Hernando de Soto, who was in the States for 1539 to 1543. And he almost certainly marched up through that area, and they refer to a town that probably was Potano, and other groups as well. So having a missionary show up would have been odd, but it wouldn't necessarily have been the first time in anybody's memory that a European had shown up.
Other comments or questions? I was wondering if, talking about heritage, do you have any writings from Timucuans that of a later age that provide some sort of history of what they came from?
Unfortunately not. No, that would be incredible. I can, at least for North America, Eastern, I can't think of any examples of that, unfortunately. So we're incredibly reliant on the chronicles of Europeans to tell those kinds of stories. The only thing that helps us out later in time is you get Europeans who fancy themselves as kind of natural scientists. This would be, people may have heard of William Bartram and people like that, for example. They took it upon themselves to, and they came to Gainesville, in fact, in the 1700s, to try to describe as much as they could about the flora and the fauna, but they would set aside large sections of their books to talk about the Native Americans, their marriage habits, what they did economically and so on, the kind of things that we wish the missionaries were writing about 100 years before that.
I also was very interested in the stipulation by the Chickasaw community that students from Chickasaw people participate in the research. Could you talk about the process of discussion with the Chickasaw community for this?
Yes, that's a good point. And I will say I gave a talk once. I was invited to Harvard to give a talk on the Explorers program, and I pointed out that they were giving us funding for research, and that we were working with them in this arrangement. It kind of took me aback. He goes, "Do you think you're selling out anyway?" I was like, "What do you mean by selling out?" And he goes, "Well, He goes, you're basically tethering your research to whatever they want to know. I said, well, I see what you're saying, but it doesn't really work out that way. It's kind of like we worked out an accommodation between ourselves. And that is, when they came up with the deal, they said, we want you to train students, run some questions you think are important by us, and we'll tell you which one we like. And so the archaeologists agreed, what would we want to know that would also be interesting? And one of them is we think about, we believe that in the 1400s, we have pretty good evidence from climatologists, there were some severe multi-decadal droughts that led to massive rearrangements and migrations in Indians in the southeast all across the landscape. And the Tombigbee River kind of runs between Mississippi and Alabama. And it looks like in the 1400s, these would be probably ancestral Chickasaws, that they first moved west to where Starkville, Mississippi is today, and then they moved north about 60 or 70 miles to Tupelo, that region where Elvis Presley's from, a distance of 70, 80 miles or so, in a process that probably took about 150 to 200 years. And we said, we're interested in following out that migration, not only in terms of the movement of people, but also because they're adapting to very different ecological circumstances. They're moving out of a river floodplain and moving into a prairie environment. So I think there are a lot of interest. And they were like, yeah, we like that. So that's how we kind of came up to that agreement. So the kids come out for 2 weeks, and it's not all archaeology. They do canoe trips. They visit caves that were probably sacred sites to their ancestors and so on. But you know, northern Mississippi is their ancestral home. They all live in Oklahoma today, or most of them today. But they're very interested in making their presence known there. I mean, the Chickasaw are a relatively wealthy nation. They're not going to try to buy Mississippi back. You know, that's unrealistic. But they want to replant themselves there in certain ways and make sure people around there are aware of their heritage. So they just broke ground on a new museum earlier this year outside of Tupelo. They have this project going on and several other things as well. And the local people are totally high on it. They just love it. They just think it's great to have them back, so to speak.
Pam, could you check whether we have anybody on Zoom who would like to make a comment?
Is there any evidence of oral history of any sort?
Yes, definitely. And so, for example, the Chickasaw originate from northern Mississippi, or I will say they were there when the Europeans showed up. The Choctaws are just due south of them. And so they have an origin migration story. And their story is that they came from somewhere in the west. They arrived in eastern Mississippi, and the two groups planted a pole in the ground. The Choctaw headed south, and then the Chickasaw went north. And that northerly migration, in fact, from the oral history, kind of coincides with the evidence I talked about before. We have the more recent historical and archaeological evidence, that northward migration, that converges very nicely with that oral history, and that's one of the reasons they were interested in it. But they have oral histories that English folks were talking to them, say, in the 1700s, and they had oral histories of remembering Hernando de Soto coming 100 years earlier than that, and so on. A lot of these oral histories were, fortunately, the Chickasaws in European times are allied very closely with the English. So folks were coming from Charleston, traders, to Chickasaw territory. And again, compared to the mission period, in contrast to the mission period, there are some English natural scientists and traders and so on who wrote some decently lengthy documents on Chickasaw history, including documenting some of their oral histories.
Dr. Cobb, will you tell them what you brought today up here?
Yes, we have I'll pass it over to Dr. Hall.
Hi there. We brought with us today some artifacts. Some are from St. Augustine and some are from the Fox Pond site that Dr. Cobb has been working at. And I'd like to invite everybody up to actually come up and take a look, and we'll give you a little history on the artifacts. And I also brought with me some museum swag that you're welcome to take with you. So please come on up and have a look at what we brought for you from our collections.